What happens when a routine morning television interview suddenly takes a turn that nobody in the studio sees coming? One question, one unexpected response. And within moments, the atmosphere shifts from light-hearted promotion to a tense exchange that leaves viewers glued to their screens. Samuel L. Jackson has built a reputation over decades as one of Hollywood's most commanding personalities. Whether he's delivering unforgettable performances on screen or speaking candidly in interviews, he's never been known for holding back when something matters to him. So when he walked into the Good Morning America studio that morning, everyone expected another polished conversation about his latest project. Instead, what unfolded became the kind of television moment people would debate long after the cameras stopped rolling. It all began like any other high-profile celebrity appearance. The lights were bright, the audience was energized. Producers moved quietly behind the scenes, making sure every second stayed on schedule. Michael Strahan greeted Jackson with his usual confidence and warmth, setting the stage for what looked like another comfortable promotional interview. The opening questions stayed exactly where everyone expected. They talked about the new film, the excitement surrounding its release, and the actor's remarkable career. Jackson answered with the calm confidence audiences have come to expect from someone who's spent decades in front of cameras. But experienced interviewers know that sometimes the biggest stories aren't hiding in prepared notes. They're hiding in the questions that nobody expects. As the conversation settled into a comfortable rhythm, Strahan decided to shift directions. "Before we get too far into the movie," he said, "I'd like to ask about comments you recently made regarding diversity in Hollywood." Those remarks sparked a lot of discussion. For a brief second, something changed. Jackson's relaxed expression disappeared. He didn't interrupt. He didn't immediately push back. Instead, there was a pause just long enough for everyone watching to notice that something had shifted. "Which comments are you referring to?" It sounded like a simple request for clarification, but underneath those words was a noticeable edge. Strahan explained that some people believe Jackson's criticism of Hollywood had been unusually harsh, especially considering the enormous success he'd achieved throughout his career. That was the moment the interview stopped feeling like promotion. Jackson leaned forward slightly. His voice remained controlled, but every word carried more weight than the last. "So being honest about problems suddenly means I'm grateful." The studio became noticeably quieter. Nobody moved. The audience wasn't laughing anymore. Even behind the cameras, crew members exchanged quick glances, sensing that the conversation was drifting far beyond its original purpose. Strahan attempted to explain that many people simply viewed Jackson's comments as overly critical of an industry that had rewarded him with extraordinary opportunities. Jackson didn't respond immediately. Instead, he asked a question of his own. "Michael, how long have you been doing television?" The unexpected reversal caught everyone off guard. Strahan answered confidently, explaining his years in broadcasting and his time on Good Morning America. Jackson nodded slowly. Then came another question. "During all those years, how many times has someone asked you to soften your opinions because they might make people uncomfortable?" Silence. The interview was no longer moving according to the producer's rundown. Strahan smiled politely, trying to guide the discussion back toward safer territory. "Maybe we're getting a little away from the main topic." Jackson immediately disagreed. "No, this is the topic." The calmness in his voice somehow made the moment feel even more intense. Because every single time someone brings up inequality, the conversation suddenly becomes about tone instead of substance. The room seemed frozen. Jackson wasn't shouting. He wasn't speaking over anyone. But every sentence landed with unmistakable force. "When people hear the word diversity," he continued, "they immediately become more interested in questioning the person speaking than the issue being discussed." The cameras kept rolling. Millions of viewers watched as what had started as a routine interview transformed into something much more personal. Strahan tried another approach. "Surely you've seen progress over the years." Jackson gave a short laugh. "Progress?" He repeated the word as though weighing its meaning. "Progress isn't pointing to a handful of success stories and pretending the work is finished. Progress isn't celebrating representation for one day and forgetting about it the next. Real progress means the conversation doesn't end simply because people become uncomfortable." The atmosphere inside the studio grew heavier with every exchange. Even people who couldn't hear what was happening behind the cameras could sense producers making rapid decisions. Should they interrupt, go to commercial, or allow the discussion to continue naturally? Nobody wanted to make the wrong call. Strahan maintained his composure, but the interview was becoming increasingly difficult to steer. He suggested that constantly focusing on these issues might distract from the positive work Jackson was trying to promote. That sentence changed everything. Jackson's expression hardened. For the first time, genuine frustration became impossible to ignore. Distract from positive work, he repeated the phrase carefully. Every project I choose, every character I bring to life, every opportunity I've earned. Those things aren't separate from what I believe. They're connected. If people see themselves in my work, then I have a responsibility to speak honestly about the world they're living in. That's not something I leave outside the studio doors. His words seemed to settle over the room. Nobody interrupted. Nobody filled the silence. For several seconds, the conversation existed entirely in that uncomfortable space where neither person wanted to back away. Strahan shifted in his chair before asking another question that seemed designed to find common ground. Isn't there a risk that conversations like this create more division instead of bringing people together? The question hung in the air. Jackson stared back for a moment without speaking. When he finally answered, his voice was quieter than before, and somehow, that made every word even more powerful. You're asking whether talking about inequality is what creates division. He slowly shook his head. That's exactly the misunderstanding people keep making. Pointing out a problem doesn't create the problem. Ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. At that moment, the interview had completely transformed. It was no longer about a movie. It was no longer about Hollywood. It had become something far more personal, and neither man appeared willing to step away from the conversation. The tension inside the studio continued to build as millions of viewers watched, wondering who would speak next, and whether there was any way back from the path this interview had just taken. The conversation was no longer about a single interview. It had become a battle over perspective. Inside the studio, every person present could feel that the carefully planned morning broadcast had taken on a life of its own. Producers watched from the control room, knowing millions of viewers were witnessing a conversation that was becoming increasingly impossible to predict. Michael Strahan took a slow breath before speaking again. I'm not saying your concerns aren't important, he explained. I'm simply asking whether the way they're presented can sometimes make people tune out. Jackson's eyes never left him. There was no interruption, no sarcastic remark. Just another measured pause. Then he answered, See, that's where we see this differently. When people speak passionately about something that affects their lives, the first question shouldn't be whether they made someone uncomfortable. It should be whether what they're saying is true. The room remained silent. Jackson continued with the confidence of someone who had spent decades navigating difficult conversations. If a firefighter runs into a building yelling that it's on fire, nobody complains about his tone. They deal with the fire. But somehow, when conversations involve inequality or fairness, everyone suddenly becomes a critic of delivery instead of substance. Strahan leaned slightly forward. I understand that point, but some viewers would argue that constant criticism can make it seem as though nothing has improved. Jackson nodded. I've heard that argument for years, and yes, progress exists. I've lived long enough to witness change. I've benefited from opportunities that many talented people before me never received, but recognizing progress doesn't require pretending the work is finished. He looked around the studio for just a moment before continuing. Success doesn't erase responsibility. If anything, it increases it. The audience remained unusually quiet. Normally, a morning television interview flowed with smiles, applause, and light-hearted conversation. This felt completely different. Every sentence seemed to carry more weight than the one before it. Strahan tried approaching the discussion from another angle. Do you ever worry that audiences become exhausted by these conversations? Jackson answered almost immediately. No, I worry about people becoming comfortable. Those are two very different things. He leaned back slightly. Comfort has a strange effect. It convinces people that because something isn't affecting them personally, double quotes, it must not be affecting anyone else. And history has shown us how dangerous that assumption can become. The word settled over the studio. Even viewers at home could sense that neither man was speaking from a prepared script anymore. This had become genuine.